So the next thing we want to look at is what's called a relative frequency histogram. No, I didn't say frequency histogram, I said relative frequency histogram. So a relative frequency histogram, it's going to be similar to a frequency histogram. The catch is the horizontal scales are the same, so we're still going to use the same class boundaries as we did in the frequency histogram. But what happens though is the vertical scales will be different. What we're going to do is we're going to use relative frequency that was found in the expanded form frequency table, frequency distribution table. We're not going to use the actual frequency. So if you recall, at the very beginning when we did our expanded frequency thing, if I can find that up here. So we're not using frequency, we're using relative frequency. We're using this data over here, relative frequency, not this data over here. So we have this 0.167, this 0.917. So all this data I'm going to bring down to our relative frequency histogram. So the class boundaries, as we said, were that 64.5 to 74.5. That's going to be a horizontal scales. So if we want to make those, I did that 64.5 to 74.5. Remember, we got those by using the class boundaries, and we kind of added and subtracted that 0.5 there. So I should have like a 124.5 over here as well. So that was our end one as well. So we got that previously. So I brought this relative frequency down, that 0.167, 0.2917, 0.1667, so forth and so on there. So when I make my relative frequency, I need to make a vertical scale. So this is where, if you're not told what to do, you have some freedom here. I chose to just go out 2 places past decimal. So I had this 0.16 or like 16, 29, 16, 20, 12, and 4. So what I decided to do is count by fives, if you will. So I have 0.05, 0.10, 0.15, 0.20, 0.25, and 0.30. So I'm going to use those as my scale, and I'm just going to estimate these values as best I can, and I'm going to plot those spots. So the first relative frequency is 0.167 or 0.17. It really doesn't really matter. So what I'm picking up on is that's going to be between 64.5 and 74.5. So I'm going to see, about here. So again, a histogram, we're creating these rectangles. So I'm going to go up just a little bit past the 0.15 and come across there. So percentage-wise, remember, these could be expressed as percents. So around 17% of the data fell between 64.5 and 74.5. So that's what they mean by relative. So percentages are kind of in play here. So only part of the data, which they're saying around 17%, was around that area. So if I would just want to make a little note there that, 17% of the data, that's an approximation, is in this rectangle here. If I want to change them to percentages by moving the decimal 1 place or 2 places to the right. So next thing we have is this 0.29. That's going to be between 74.5 and 84.5. So 0.29 is going to be close to 0.30. So I'm going to go halfway in between there and make a little dot there to give me a little bit of a reference point. So I'm going to bring this rectangle all the way up to this. Remember, they share the same boundaries on the edges there. And now I'm just going to bring this all the way down. So roughly, that's about 29% of our data goes there if I'm talking percent math. So our next one is, again, this 0.167. So again, this should be about the same height. So I'm going to come across there and bring that across. And again, we can kind of see that 17% of the data, if I change it to a decimal to a percent, it would be that. So again, I'm just moving the decimal 2 places to the right. That's 16, and that 6 kind of would tell me to round up to 17. So I have this 0.20. So that's going to be, this next piece is going to be about here. So I'm going to use that as a reference point, kind of make a midpoint, eyeballing it if I can. So again, that's about 21% of our data is there if I'm using percent math, because that 8 would mean to make that a 1, so 0.21. So 104 to 114.5, looks like I lost my 1 there, 104 to 114. So that's like 0.125 or so, around 0.12 if I'm guessing a little bit, estimating. So that's a little bit below 0.15, probably halfway between 0.10 and 0.15. So I'm going to try to make that about halfway there. So make my little rectangle there. So again, it doesn't be perfect. So again, that's, 12.5% would be about 13% if I'm rounding to the nearest value there. So I get this 13% instead of saying 12.5%. And then, we have this 0.04. So 0.04 is going to be a little bit below 0.05. So come over here and maybe just drop down a hair. That's going to be my last little rectangle about here. And that's about 4% of the data would be in this region here. So you kind of see that the bulk of the data is really between 74.5 and 104.5. So if I was adding these percentages, it's like 29 or say 30, that's like 20 basically. That's like a 30, a 20, and a 20 if I'm estimating. So about 70% of the data is between 74.5 and 94.5. As far as fractions go, 70% could be close to 66%, which is like 2/3. So you could say 2/3 of the data is between 74.5 and 104.5. You could also say, hey, 70% is close to 75%. And you could say, well, that's like 3/4. So 3/4 of data is between 74.5 and 104.5. So this is where you have to have a little bit of number sense to kind of pick up on sense. So that's where surrounding and stuff can kind of give you some ballparks. And percentages really help that out, though. So keep that in mind. We'll talk more about that as we go along here. But notice that, 70%, I could be using either 2/3 or 3/4. And, since I kind of rounded up aggressively, I technically probably should be rounding back down to 2/3 instead of rounding up even more. That's probably making the data interpret a little bit too far to the right. So I need to kind of bring it back down a little bit to this 2/3 of the data. So let's see where that takes us here. So that's how we would construct a relative frequency histogram. So we have to use the relative frequencies as our vertical axis. And then they ask you to start interpreting the information a little bit. And you're trying to see if there's any patterns that are going on here. Not a whole lot, but I do kind of see that the bulk of the data is here. 74.5 to say 104.5 is where most of the data. That would be my interpretation. You could have a different interpretation. That's the fun thing about statistics. Okay, I'll stop there.